Hi again. Those of you who had A&P1 from me last semester have had an introduction to this topic when we talked about cell communication. The two main ways that your body controls the activity of all your cells is with the nervous system, which sends signals directly to the cells. The release a neurotransmitter, crosses a really tiny synapse, and binds to receptors on those cells, and it makes them do whatever they're supposed to do. Or with hormones, other type of signaling molecules that can be released into the blood, into the interstitial fluid, or whatever, and make its way to a target cell that has the right receptors, so it's not as direct a contact as you would have with the nervous system. It's a more widespread effect, but still you're just affecting the cells that are designed to respond to that particular hormone or hormone type substance. So the endocrine system, if a true endocrine hormone secretes hormones into the blood, they bind to target cells somewhere else in the body and stimulate them to do something. We'll talk about other kinds of signaling cells too, but true endocrine, a true hormone is in the bloodstream. Endocrine glands, they're small, they're very powerful. They usually are ductless. They're not made like sweat glands that have a ball of cells that secrete sweat into a tube, and then that single tube goes somewhere. Instead, the endocrine glands, a lot of cuboidal type cells, and are secreting directly across membranes into the bloodstream in some way. Hormones, carried by the blood. If it's a non-hormone type other signaling molecule, it is a hormone type molecule somewhere else. It could be released by one cell and just move through the interstitial fluid to a nearby cell, but it doesn't make it into the bloodstream. The target cells tend to be remote then. It's got to go all the way through the bloodstream to get there. Peptide hormones, mostly made from amino acid type. Well, a peptide is made from amino acids, but there are other types of substances that go into it, but most of them are either made from a variety of amino acids or steroids made from cholesterol, two main categories that act differently, carried differently, transported differently, everything. So a true endocrine gland, the pituitary gland, it secretes hormones into the blood. Thyroid and parathyroid glands secrete hormones into the blood. The pancreas probably belongs down here on the mixed system, because the pancreas also secretes digestive juices. So it can have different types of cells within the same tissue. But your adrenal gland, the pineal gland, the gonads, the testes, and so forth, are endocrine glands. You can have some crossover. For instance, the testes themselves will secrete not only testosterone, but sperm. They make sperm. So those are kind of a mixed thing. You don't have to know which ones are mixed and which ones are not, but some are designed to do nothing but hormones, and some do a few other things too. Neuroendocrine is a nerve that secretes its neurotransmitter directly into the bloodstream. We have a couple of these. They come from the hypothalamus, which is your main control of all of your hormonal system. It gets all kinds of signals in from everywhere in the body, telling you what your blood pressure is and your temperature and how high your thyroid level is and how high your testosterone level and all that kind of stuff. And the hypothalamus will then start sending signals to other parts of the system to do things. It will send either hormones down into the anterior pituitary and stimulate those cells to release their hormones, or it has some big nerves in it that send the signals directly to the back of the pituitary and release the neurotransmitter directly into the bloodstream from the hypothalamus through the posterior pituitary and into the bloodstream. So anyway, that's what a neurohormone would be. A neuroendocrine gland is using a nerve to directly send a substance into the blood. So here are the main ones. We have the pineal gland back here, which we'll talk about just briefly. The hypothalamus and pituitary are huge in the control of the system. You have the thyroid gland with the parathyroid stuck onto it. The thymus gland. In here we have the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys. Renal is kidney. The kidneys themselves will secrete some hormones too, but the adrenal glands are big hormone producers. The pancreas produces insulin and glucagon to control your blood sugar, in addition to secreting digestive hormones, or enzymes, I should say. And the gonads, the ovaries in females and testes in the male, that they have to produce eggs and sperm, but they also are going to secrete a lot of hormones into the body, estrogen, testosterone, and so forth. Other tissues will produce hormones. A lot of them will produce what could be more described as a hormone-like substance that will act on nearby cells, but not necessarily go through the bloodstream. But some of them go through the bloodstream too. The brain produces hormones, serotonin and dopamine and things like that. The small intestine uses a lot of those same hormones in controlling its action, usually released locally as a hormone-like substance through the interstitial fluid. Kidneys release hormones. Fat cells release hormones that affect your ability to utilize energy. The heart produces hormones. It'll produce the atrial natriuretic peptide, which causes you to secrete a little bit more sodium and thus water, and lower your blood pressure some. The stomach releases hormones, especially a couple that tell you whether you're full or hungry. Most amino acids are, most hormones are amino acid based. They're peptides. They are water soluble. There's a big difference between how our water soluble hormones act and our fat soluble ones. Fat soluble ones are steroids and thyroid hormone, which isn't exactly fat soluble, but it acts like it, so we can lump it into that category for the purposes of figuring out how it's going to work for us. So you have peptide hormones that are water soluble. They dissolve easily in the blood, so they don't have to be carried by a transporter or something. And then you have steroids and thyroid hormone, which are not really very water soluble, so they have to be carried on a transport protein of some kind. So there's a different step in getting them to do their job. A couple others, eicosanoids, leukotrienes, prostaglandins, they have to do with your inflammatory response and pain. And they are lipids. They're produced in your endothelial cells and released into the bloodstream. Some of these will go and act as signaling molecules to tell the hypothalamus to do something. Or they'll signal the immune system to do something. Pain, contraction, blood clotting. These aren't in red. We're not going to spend much time with those. We're going to spend our time with mostly these guys and a few of these guys, the really important ones. So, hormone action, it's released from someplace, it goes into the blood, it goes someplace else, it will only attach to a cell that has the right receptors on it, and so it's the receptor on the cell that decides whether a hormone will have any effect or not. thyroid stimulating hormone is released into your general circulation, but it only affects the thyroid gland because that's the only place you have TSH receptors. So the water-based hormones are going to go easily through the blood, and they're going to find a cell that's got a receptor on the surface. They can't cross the membrane because they're water-based, and lipid membranes don't let water-based substances cross easily. So they bind to the surface, and that receptor will send a signal into the cell to do something. On the other hand, the steroids will have a tendency to go across the membrane, across the nuclear membrane, and have its effect on your DNA, actually on the nucleus. Here's just a partial list of all the things that hormones can do. They're very flexible in what they do, but it depends on that receptor on that cell. If that cell wants to be turned on by epinephrine, then it uses a receptor that has a mechanism that turns on the cell. But you can bind that same hormone to a different receptor that turns off the cell and wind up turning it off. So it's that receptor and the mechanism attached to it that decides what happens. If I flip a switch on the wall, if it's hooked up to lights, the lights come on. If it's hooked up to the heat comes on. If it's hooked up to the stereo, the music comes on. So it's what's hooked up to that receptor. It could bind my same finger, but it could turn on a variety of different things depending on what it's bound to on the inside. So you can open and close ion channels to let sodium rush in and turn on a muscle cell, for instance. It can go into the nucleus and turn on protein synthesis, so you make proteins, enzymes, and things, contractile proteins. Testosterone will turn on the muscle's ability to make more contractile proteins, so your muscles get bigger. It can activate or deactivate enzymes in the cell to speed up or slow down chemical reactions. It can cause that cell to secrete its hormones or some other substance that you may need to be secreted. So when you turn it on, it secretes stuff. You can stimulate it to start splitting and cause reproduction, cause an increase in the number of cells. Metabolic processes speed up or slow down the metabolism, the production or use of ATP. You can increase anabolism, in other words, creating molecules, and catabolism, which is breaking them down into smaller pieces. It can cause muscles to contract or relax. All of them. Skeletal muscle, heart muscle, smooth muscle. Hormones can increase their contraction or decrease it. It can regulate excretion and absorption of ions by the kidney to make you retain something or pee it out more. It can control reproductive processes, help decide whether a fetus turns out to be a male or a female. So these are just a few of the many things that hormones can do. Anything you can think of that your body might need to do, there's probably at least two hormones, one that'll make it do it more and one that'll make it do it less. And it's based on the receptors on that cell that can bind those hormones and be stimulated that way. Hormones also can affect other hormones. They can make it easier for a hormone to do its job or inhibit it, a way of controlling it so that you get enough but not too much of a effect. They can also affect your behavior. We know that people have mood swings when their hormonal levels go up and down. Women during the sexual cycle, the reproductive cycle, men with testosterone and aggression and so forth. Pheromones are signaling molecules that are mostly breathed in, sometimes tasted, that affect attraction of one person to another. as I said, the peptide or water-soluble hormones, which are most of them, they act by binding to the surface, turning on a system which makes a second messenger, which is like a hormone little substance inside the cell, because the one from the outside, that first messenger, all it can do is flip the switch. But the receptor has to then turn on the process inside the cell. And they'll generally use a second signaling molecule inside the cell then to carry that message on in and make it happen. The steroid hormones and thyroid hormone that are fat soluble tend to cross the cell membrane and to go into the nucleus. There are receptors directly on the DNA and RNA molecules inside the nucleus, and when the hormone binds to them, you suddenly start making more contractile proteins to make your muscles stronger, or something, whatever that cell needs to make. We talked about this in ANP1, in my ANP1, but I know not everybody covers G proteins, so we're going to do it again. A G protein, it's called that because it uses guanylyl cyclase as its main chunk. So it's a G-type protein, okay? It's a G protein, and it will bind a water-soluble first messenger, just a hormone coming from the outside. Remember, anything that binds to a receptor is called a ligand. So whether it's a neurotransmitter, whether it's a hormone, whether it's another molecule that turns that cell on in some way, once you bind that receptor, it's said to be liganded. It has some sort of a signaling molecule stuck onto it. So anyway, we have our G proteins. These are used for water-based hormones that can't cross the membrane. They bind to the outside of that G protein. It turns on a second messenger inside the cell and makes cells do a whole bunch of different things. The main ones that we're concerned about are the GS and GQ. The G stimulating protein causes the cell to make the internal signaling molecule cyclic AMP. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. GS makes cyclic AMP. G inhibitory actually binds to the same sites and causes the cell to make less cyclic AMP. Okay, so here we can make more or less depending on what we're binding. I'm more interested in turning on stuff than in slightly modulating it, but the GS stimulates cyclic AMP, GI inhibits it, and the GQ uses a different receptor, a different internal mechanism, causes you to make inositol trisphosphate, which is IP3, and that causes the endoplasmic reticulum in these cells to release calcium from their storage into the cell. Because calcium inside the cell does a lot of things. One of the main things it always does is make a muscle cell contract. So if you want to get a smooth muscle cell to contract, your intestine, your blood vessel, something, if you want to get a smooth muscle to contract, you're going to use a GQ protein because it's going to give you calcium to cause the smooth muscle to contract. GQ, calcium, contract. Q, calcium, contract. GS, cyclic AMP, relax. Smooth muscle, relax, cyclic AMP, GS. It all rhymes. So if I want to get my bronchi to dilate so I can breathe better, I use a GS protein. I bind that. And when I first start exercising, I bind a lot of GS proteins. And the bronchioles open up so I can breathe better. If I need my blood pressure to go up, I use GQs on the blood vessels. It makes them contract by allowing more calcium contraction GQ in the cell. Here's the GS. You bind your hormone to the outside. Here's the GS protein. Okay, it uses guanylyl cyclase. It uses GTP as its kind of power molecule here. A piece of it comes off. It goes over to adenylate cyclase, which is an enzyme on the membrane. It takes your ATP in there and converts it to AMP. So ATP has three adenosine triphosphate. You get rid of two of those and it becomes adenosine monophosphate. And because it can cycle back and forth between ATP and AMP, they call it cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is a great intracellular signaler. It does a lot of things. But for physiology, one of the main things it does is make smooth muscle relax. Here we have, this is actually a GI protein. You bind it there and it inhibits the production of cyclic AMP. So here we are going to make just the right amount of cyclic AMP because we're stimulating the right amount of stimulators and the right amount of inhibitors. But the GS is the one that I will spend way more time with than GIs. Your GQ protein looks pretty much the same. It uses a different effector. Here we have phospholipase C instead of adenylate cyclase. So it makes IP3. IP3 causes the endoplasmic reticulum to release its calcium. Calcium causes smooth muscle to contract by binding with calmodulin. So bind to a GQ, you make IP3, release calcium, contract. And your steroid hormones, they can go right on through because they're lipid-based. Fats can cross fat membranes. And they will go in and bind. There are some receptors floating around in the cytosol that they can bind to, but the cytosol's out here. They could bind to something out here. A few of them do, or they can bind to something in here. But more likely, they're going to bind right on those DNA strands and cause you to make proteins. Remember, target cell specificity, and it will only bind to a cell that has the right receptor on it. That makes sense. And whether or not a response depends. You have to have the right receptors. You have to have the right numbers of them, and how many hormones are binding to these guys, and how much these receptors really want to bind to that hormone. And all of these things you can change. Your cell membrane can actually add or reduce receptors if it wants to be more or less stimulated. Those receptors can become more or less eager to bind. And of course, you can release more or less hormone. So these are a variety of ways that a cell can decide. Upregulation means the cell membrane has made more receptors. If you don't have enough hormone level and that cell needs a better stimulus, it can make more receptors and stick them in the membrane so it can do a better job of binding what's there. Downregulation. If you're being overstimulated, cells will pull receptors off the membrane and downregulate the number of receptors so they don't get overstimulated. So you can make a huge difference in the number of receptors on your individual cell's membrane. Now, hormone systems are controlled by negative feedback mechanisms. We talked about that the very first thing last semester. Negative feedback. When you need something to happen, it causes a response once the response happens, it turns it back off. That's the negative feedback. Once your blood pressure goes up enough, you stop making it go up anymore. You turn off the blood pressure going up mechanism. Okay, so that's negative feedback. When your temperature gets high enough, you stop making more heat. Instead, you start sweating to bring it back down. So negative feedback will shut off a system once it gets what it needs to be. And that's the way hormones work. And it's one of the main things you're going to want to learn, memorize, or whatever in this hormone section is what is the negative feedback pathway for each hormone. When thyroid hormone gets too high, how do you stop making more? Okay, well, the thyroid stimulating hormone drops down, so you don't stimulate the thyroid as much. If your thyroid hormone gets too low, you're going to make more TSH, more thyroid stimulating hormone to bring it back up. Once it gets where it needs to be, then it cuts itself off, negative feedback. So here we have, this is thyroid hormone, and this is thyroid stimulating hormone. If there's not enough of this, you make a lot more of this until you get enough. If there's too much of this, you make less of this until it comes down to where it needs to be. Now, how do the glands get stimulated to do this stuff? Well, there are a couple of different ways. One is humoral, which just means the amount of stuff in the blood. Well, let's say parathyroid hormone is designed to balance your calcium out. Your parathyroid gland's job is to keep calcium in your blood where it's supposed to be. So they have calcium receptors. And when there's not enough calcium binding to them, they release more parathyroid hormone, and it brings your calcium level up. If there's too much calcium bound, they make less parathyroid hormones. Your calcium can go down again. So this is humoral. Calcium isn't a hormone. It is just the substance you're trying to regulate. Now, glucose is the same way. I mean, it's the amount of glucose that decides how much insulin you'll make. Glucose isn't a hormone. It's just the stuff you're trying to regulate. So humoral signaling is simply binding that substance that you're regulating to the surface of the gland to make it do more or less. They can be turned on hormonally. For instance, the thyroid gland is stimulated by thyroid stimulating hormone. So a hormone is stimulating a gland to make its hormone. That's very common. You stimulate the testes to make testosterone. You stimulate the adrenal gland to make cortisol. And you can have neural stimulation. Your sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal gland to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into your blood as a fight or flight mechanism. So some hormone tissues, hormone-releasing tissues, glands, are stimulated by nerves. So they can be stimulated by nerves, hormones, or by the very substance they're trying to regulate. Here we have parathyroid glands. They're being stimulated by the amount of calcium in the blood. Okay, so that's humoral. Here we have the adrenal gland being stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. There's a neural stimulation. Here we have the thyroid gland being stimulated by thyroid stimulating hormone. The adrenal cortex being stimulated by adrenocorticotropin hormone. The gonads, the testes, being stimulated by the gonadal hormones. And so that causes them then to release their hormones. All right. Kind of short, but kind of rich in concepts. In the next lecture, we'll start looking at the individual hormones and what they do.